Hello Internet and welcome to the channel. My name is Frankie and in this build I accidentally make a massive Pokeball kind of enclosure. The basic idea for this enclosure was I just wanted it to be round. Too often I make fairly normal, basic looking enclosures in terms of their shape. I normally like to concentrate on what's inside them, but I thought I'd play about and make a perfectly round enclosure this time and maybe have something in the middle. In order to create a circular enclosure, I start by making some kind of guidelines with the paths. To do this, I will start by making a semicircle with a path. Fortunately, Jurassic World Evolution 2's path controls are quite a bit better than the first game, so you can make circles fairly easy. And then in order to make bigger circles, because your paths don't necessarily extend that far, I branch out from the inner circle, make sure that the two paths you create are of equal length, and then join those two up with a curved path. Then there will be some guidelines when you try to place your next path that will automatically join the curvature of the path you have just created. You continue doing that, go all the way around, and by the time you get back to where you started, you should have a nice perfect circle. From the get-go, I knew that I wanted to have either an aviary or a lagoon in the middle, but I already had a lagoon, so we went with an aviary, and once I'd placed it down, it was apparent that the circle wasn't quite big enough, so I decided to extend it by once again adding two paths and joining them up, then continuing the circle round and placing the aviary right in the middle. You can then delete all of the guidelines you previously created and start to build your enclosure from there. With the aviary placed in the middle of our circular path, I decided to add both a hatchery and a viewing gallery to opposite sides of the aviary. I can then link paths to those, which go straight to the edge of the circle, dividing it in half quite nicely. However, it's a little bit off center here, just like you can see, but I decided to go ahead with it anyway, thinking that half and half being slightly different sizes wouldn't matter too much. However, the difference in the sizes of each half became a bit more transparent when I was adding the paths, especially to the viewing gallery, because as that's going to be guest accessible, I wanted it to have two paths rather than one, just to look a bit nicer, whereas the path that linked to the hatchery was going to be the normal staff path that's really boring. What you can see with the guest path is where it meets the edge of the circle, because there are two components of the path. It's really quite obvious that it's not central. It doesn't look great, but at this point I decided to just go ahead with it anyway, because it's more about just achieving this look of a circular enclosure with another enclosure inside of it, rather than getting it perfect. As with the rest of the park, I decided to use the quite thick, sturdy looking fences. I want the fences to be uniform across the whole park. When adding these fences to this area, I wanted it to be as close to both the aviary and the paths as I possibly could get it. It took a bit of time to make sure it was uniform and it didn't look too wibbly wobbly, but I think it really pays off in the end. Now, make sure you're keeping that outer circle whilst you're doing this, because that is your guideline for getting the fences the exact shape you want. Once you're happy with the circular shape of the enclosure, once you've got all your fences down, you can then remove the main circle part of the path, leaving just the paths for both the hatchery and the viewing gallery. Now, I feel like it's kind of important for me to leave all of this footage in. In the end, once I've finished adding all the fencing and the paths, I've removed all the trees and stuff so I can see it as clearly as possible, I realise I really don't like how this looks. It's a matter of it not being symmetrical enough. I thought it wouldn't be a problem at the beginning, but upon looking at it now, I just really don't like it. So I do what is kind of scary to do when you've already invested this much time, and that's just delete a bunch of stuff. I'm going to remove all of the central fencing and the paths. I'll keep the outside because that allows me to see the perfect circle without redoing the pathing. And then I'm going to have to redo all of the central stuff. I will start by replacing the aviary in the center. This time I'm going to make sure it's directly in the center, but I'm going to have to do it by eye, which isn't too much of a problem. I just make sure that I'm looking at it in a bird's eye view and it should be fine. Then once I'm happy with the placement, I can rebuild what I've just done in terms of the the hatchery, viewing gallery, their associated paths, and then the fencing that goes round both the paths and the actual aviary. Once I'm done, I am much happier with how it looks and decide to finalise it and start actually working on the enclosures. I am happy with this much more symmetrical look, and I would urge you to do the same. Now, in terms of what we're going to be doing with these enclosures, so far I've been kind of focusing on the periods of which dinosaurs come from. But now I'm just going to experiment a bit and use dinosaurs that I simply haven't used enough. I want these areas to be kind of recessed. I think that's going to look pretty good, having the aviary be quite raised in the middle, and the paths will also be raised, allowing the guests to look down into these enclosures, which I just think makes it a lot more dynamic. So to do that, I use the lowering terrain tool on the largest radius I can, start to dig out some of the area, and then I will flatten it all to that depth. And it took a bit of playing about with, because I wanted the edges to be at the same height that the rest of the ground is, so that the inside of the enclosure is really recessed. So what I settled on doing was flattening as much of the area as I could, regardless of what it does to the fencing. Then later, I can come back and flatten the fencing, like the ground that the fencing is on. I can flatten that to the same height that just outside of the enclosure, meaning it will look, it just uniforms it all, which is really, really good. Once I'm happy with the depth of each enclosure, it's time to add some water, and to begin with I'm just going to cover as much of the ground as I possibly can, because I know that I won't be able to put that much in there due to the amount of sloping that's going on at the edge of the enclosures. And apparently one of them was a lot wider than the other in terms of how much ground area was left, because I really couldn't put that much water in the second enclosure, which was quite strange and I couldn't really figure out why. But once I finally managed to do so, I kept it to that small amount and kind of had that be the theme of that enclosure. Have just a few ponds, whereas the other one can be much more watery, kind of like a swamp, and that would allow me to use a kind of swamp based dinosaur, which I'm kind of happy I did, because I love that aesthetic. I love creating the swamplands for things like the baryonyx or the suchomimus. I just think that kind of enclosure looks really cool. And once I decided that one of these enclosures would be more swampy, I had to start carving up the water and stuff, but before that I knew that I wanted a pescivore dinosaur in here, something that eats fish. So before I carve up the water, I need to place some fish feeders in there so that I know that they definitely fit. I have one at each end of the enclosure, and then I can start using the remove water tool to make the water area look a lot more interesting, because at the moment it kind of just covers all of the available area, which really isn't that interesting. Once I was happy with the general layout of these enclosures and the amount of water in them, I had a little look at a bird's eye view. I didn't want to place any trees right now because I didn't know what was needed for each of the dinosaurs that was going to be going in there. But something that I did notice is how much this enclosure looks like a Pokeball, and I decided to play with that a bit. I got out the paintbrush tool and applied sand to one half of the enclosure, well, one of the enclosures, one half of this ball, so that it kind of looked like the white bottom of a Pokeball and the red top, even though it's not red, you know what I mean. I didn't think I was going to do this. Part of me was like, no, don't do it, it's silly, it's just going to look really weird. But you know what? I gave in. My love of Pokemon won me over. I was like, let's include it in my park. And it's just a bit of fun, isn't it? So, yeah, you don't have to do that by any means, but I thought it was quite funny. As I said previously, I didn't know what dinosaurs I wanted when I was going into this kind of enclosure build, but after making one of them quite swampy and this one quite sandy, and having a little browse of the dinosaurs available, I decided to go with Deinonychus for the swampy pescivore enclosure, And then for the sandy enclosure, I went for Dimetrodon. Both these dinosaurs, I know Dimetrodon isn't a dinosaur, but you know, just for a general term, both of these creatures have not been used in my parks very much, so I thought it'd be a really cool chance to get some quite unusual looking dinosaurs, creatures into my parks. And with that being said, why don't we release our wobbly little quadrupeds and have the Dimetrodon come out and just have a look at how they come out of the hatchery, because it's one of the best animations seeing the creatures come out of the hatchery. So let's just have a look. Now, when did something this squat and derpy looking learn to run that fast? I'm really quite surprised that those ones were running that quickly out of the gate. Was pretty funny. I really like the variation in colour here. I think we've got some nice reddy oranges colours and some really nice muted tones as well. Whenever I talk about colours, it's worth saying I am colourblind, so it might look a lot more interesting to me than it does to you, or it might look a lot less interesting. I'm not entirely sure. Either way, I like the look of these creatures. Let's get them into their habitats so that we can start to figure out what they actually need. I'm not sure if these guys hunt or not. I have a feeling they're just going to need meat, because I can't quite picture them tackling a goat. After a quick check, it does turn out they need some meat, so I'm going to go and pop down a meat feeder in the enclosure for them. I think we're just going to stick to one for now, and we'll get them over there as soon as possible, start adding some foliage and rocks for them, because of course an enclosure like this is going to need some rocks. Whilst I'm waiting for them to land in their enclosure, I'm going to go onto our rocks and just put it on random selection and random rotation, and just put loads all over the enclosure. It's a really cool opportunity to make quite a themed enclosure here. We're going to be really sandy and rocky. It's going to look like a desert. So I'm going to use as many rocks as I want, because I normally try to restrict myself, only really putting them around the water areas, but I think they're so cool, so I'm going to add as many as I want in this enclosure. Go a bit mad. Now that they are landing in the enclosure, I can check out their forest needs and stuff and start to add a little bit of foliage just to fill this place out. I didn't really want to put that much in terms of trees and whatnot, and they don't really need that much either. But it does look very plain, even with the variation in elevation throughout the enclosure and all of the rocks and sand. It does look very different to other enclosures, but it still looks quite plain. So I think adding a decent amount of foliage, not too much, and we're going to go for a different type. We're not going for this lush, jungly looking stuff we've been using for most of the park, but we're going to go for the more pine tree look that is used at the entrance to the park. I think that's going to separate it, continue to make it look quite unique compared to other enclosures in the park, and I don't know, I just think those trees kind of work better with this ground texture that we've chosen. So I'm going to dot those all around the edges as per usual, and then just some select clumps of actual trees throughout the enclosure as well, rather than just bushes and stuff. I'm also going to try and use that dried grass texture on some areas as well, just to fill in some of the open space. It seems as though these guys are happy enough in their new enclosure. We're going to see a little social animation here, but because of all of the weird terraforming I've done, they don't quite work and they sink into the floor. Although this is quite a cute animation. It's like they're kind of having a hug. Oh, okay, step on his head. That's not the nicest, is it? Disappear into the hill whilst you're at it. Now that we know our Dimetrodon are happy, I think it's time to release our Dinocyrus and work on their enclosure. Now, I've just got to say it, I love these guys. They're like these weird, big, fluffy ducks. They're so cool. I love dinosaurs that look really weird compared to your traditional ones. And when I say traditional, you know, when you think of dinosaurs, you think of a T-Rex or a Triceratops or a Raptor. You don't often think of these guys. They're so goofy looking, I just love them. Let's get them over to their enclosures so we can start to make them a nice little habitat. Now, one thing that I know about a swamp is, although it's a lot about the water, it is equally quite important that you have a lot of foliage and plant life. So they like to feed on ground leaf. We're going to be placing a lot of that all around the edge of the water because I think shrubs and grasses and stuff will grow close to the water line, as you know, the soil's got the most moisture right there. And then we're going to focus on placing a couple, not many, just a few little kind of clumps of trees around the edge, because the trees that we have here aren't like the ones that you'd find in the mangroves or something. They're not really adapted to growing in such moist environments, so they're going to be growing further away from the water, where they'd be able to get adequate sunlight and not be overexposed to moisture. Overall, this enclosure really doesn't require too much work. It's just a matter of making sure you've got a nice balance between plant life and water. You can really easily get a nice looking swamp aesthetic. Maybe you want to use the dirt tool under all the water, around the water's edge, just to make it look a bit more muddy. It's not entirely necessary. Let's have a little look at this guy's feeding animation as he gobbles on a fish. Right, it's safe to say that these two Deinocheirus are happy with their enclosure, so we'll let them get used to it, and I think we should go and sort out the aviary. Due to the limited space of this aviary, as we wanted to keep it to the smallest one we could, we're not going to be able to have many large species. So we're going to go for the smallest one, and that is our little moth eater. So we're going to place our moth or insect feeder, and we're going to create a sandy environment, I think, because I'm leaning into this pokeball idea, and the button in the middle of a pokeball is white. So we're going to have it be the same as the white part of our pokeball enclosure that we've already done. And we're going to have to make sure we can obviously get some water in here, but I couldn't place it down with having already placed down a feeder, so I'm going to need to get rid of that, put the water down, and then reintroduce the feeder. Unfortunately, when you've got a aviary that is this small, it becomes really difficult to place any of the things in there because they all just overlap and interfere with each other. So this is as much water as I can get, and you can see it's really not very much, and yet I'm still going to carve into it a little bit, make it look just a little bit more interesting rather than just a big round blob. And that will allow me space to place the insect feeder again, which is great because we need a food source, obviously. And then I'm going to decorate with various rocks, a few shrubs, and going to try and squeeze some trees in here, hopefully, and maybe even a platform for our flyers to land on. With the decorations being where I want them, it's time to go and release our adorable Jailopterus. Now, how cute are these guys? Not only are they tiny, but they've got massive eyes and they're lovely and fuzzy. I just think they are absolutely adorable. Quite happy to have these guys in the park because once again it's quite an unusual one. And I think it suits this area really well, having a really little aviary with really little creatures in it. So that is the end of my Pokeball build. I really hope you enjoyed this video, and if you did, please consider giving it a thumbs up or subscribing to the channel to see more, or maybe just watch another one of the videos in this series. In the next video we're going to be introducing a buttload more carnivores, so make sure you subscribe to see that. Thank you for watching, and until next time, I'll see you later.